Hello. In this video, we're going to be talking about Euripides' play Medea, and my internet connection is unstable, so this is, I think, not going to be the smoothest video in the world, but I'm extremely excited to be joined by Dr. Anna Conser, who's going to talk not only about Medea, but about music in ancient Greek tragedy, which is what her specialty is. So first off, Anna, thanks very much for joining me.
For having me.
So let me pull up the bio. So Dr. Anna Conser just finished her PhD in classics at Columbia University, where she wrote her dissertation on the musical design of Greek tragedy. In her dissertation, she lays the groundwork for a new approach to tragic odes by demonstrating that linguistic pitch accents often trace the rises and falls of their lost melodic settings. This allows her to interpret tragedies in light of their original musical design, much as one would approach the lyrics of opera or musical theater. Dr. Conser has published on an overview of this new approach and the evidence behind it in the specialist journal Greek and Roman Musical Studies, and is currently revising her dissertation into a book addressing the musical design of several ancient dramas, including Medea. Dr. Conser's research interest in performance stems in part from her practical experience as a director, composer, and choreographer for modern productions of ancient drama. During her graduate studies, she worked on 10 such projects, most notably directing original language productions of Aeschylus's Libation Bearers and Sophocles' Women of Trachis. For both of these shows, she worked with a professional composer on musical settings of the Greek text, giving rise to the questions addressed in her dissertation. More recently, Dr. Conser put her research on accentual melodies into practice by composing a reconstructed vocal score for Euripides' Heracles. And down below in the description of this video, I'll put links to the videos from these productions. In her current position as a visiting assistant professor at Whitman College, she is directing a production of Euripides' Medea that will be staged next spring with a collaborative musical score ranging from folk and jazz to heavy metal, translating the play's original musical design into a modern musical idiom. So let's start very basically, I guess. Can you give us a fairly brief plot summary of Medea?
Yeah. So the play opens after what might have originally been the more famous part of the narrative. So Jason had traveled with the Argonauts to Colchis on the Black Sea to retrieve the Golden Fleece. Medea had helped him there and then brought her back. Then she had come back with him to Greece. The play begins when they're in Greece, in Corinth, when Jason has married the princess of Corinth, so betrayed Medea and married the princess, securing his own position as the heir to the Corinthian throne, but leaving Medea somewhat in the lurch. That's where we begin. Medea is naturally quite upset about this and plans to avenge herself. Early scenes of the play, we see her interact with a series of male figures. She faces off with them and kind of defines her character in opposition to them. So first, she faces the Corinthian king Creon, who tells her that he is frankly quite scared of her and wants to see her banished. So she needs to get out. She sort of subtly manipulates him. She tries different strategies. First, pliant, very humble before him in a way that is maybe not so characteristic of her, and eventually appeals to him as a father who loves his daughter and should understand her desire to save her children, and gets him to let her stay for 24 hours so that she can get her affairs in order so that she and her sons can leave in a somewhat better position than they would be otherwise. In the next scene, she faces Jason himself. And they've got these two long monologues paired that sort of portray their different perspectives on their marriage and what it meant. She, recounts all the different ways she's helped him, what a good ally she's been, and rebukes him for being the bad guy who has left her after all she's done for him. He counters with what is actually a quite pretty persuasive considering the circumstances speech. He says that he's done it all for her, for their family, that now they'll be in a much better position with this new alliance with the local princes, and everything will work out great. It's a really striking contrast of perspectives that sets the stage. Notably in this scene, she really doesn't get pretty much unmitigated Medea. She doesn't seem to be attempting to manipulate him. She's really just going. So the third man she interacts with, she's ready to enact her revenge, but she's missing one piece, and this is her escape route. Conveniently, at this moment, the king of Athens, Aegeus, shows up, and she kind of manipulates him into accepting her as a visitor in Athens, no matter what happens next. She exacts a promise from him in exchange for agreeing to help him somehow get children. It's implied that it might be through her magic potions, but at the same time, there's a lot of erotic language in this scene, and it reads a little bit like a seduction. So having secured her escape route, she goes ahead with her plan. First, she calls Jason out and apologizes to him profusely, the irrationally jealous woman that Jason had earlier accused her of being, to show that she's sorry and, of course, to secure her children's position in the new household. She offers to send bridal gifts to the Corinthian princess. These, of course, will be poisoned. Having successfully manipulated Jason into agreeing to this plan, she's faced with this great moment of decision. Should she murder her children to complete her vengeance on Jason or not? She has this long soliloquy, which is often referred to as her great monologue, in which she debates with herself over this contradiction that really defines her character. On the one hand, she's a mother, she loves her children, and she wants to see them grow and thrive. At the same time, she's also a heroic figure, and she has been dishonored, and she really wants to avenge herself. In the end, the hero wins out, and she goes ahead with her plan. This is followed by a long and horrific messenger speech describing how the princess died a slow and terrible death after putting on the gifts that Medea sent, how Creon, her father, ran into his daughter and embraced her, such that he died together with her. They were sort of bound in this terrible parent-child death. And at this point, Medea enters the house. And during the choral ode which follows, we hear the children scream. They are calling for help, asking what their mother's doing, and then ominously fall silent in the latter part of the ode. We can presume why. The play concludes appearing not out of the stage building, but above it, presumably elevated by a crane. She's triumphant. She's in a fiery chariot that had been given to her by her grandfather, this god. And at this point, she really becomes the divine figure that she is in some of the other mythic traditions surrounding her. She has the bodies of her murdered sons, confronts Jason one last time, and flies away, getting away with it, completely unpunished for her crime and unrepentant. So that kind of wraps up the overview of the story. Sorry if that wasn't particularly brief, but it hits most of the interesting.
So I'm going to turn off my video to see if we can get a little bit better video quality on your end. So I think the first question, like maybe the most common question people think about or have when encountering Medea for the first time is like, is this a feminist play? Or is it a proto-feminist play? Is it an anti-feminist play? So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because of how we define these things. To say that the play is feminist would suggest that it's a play with a clear-cut message, which it certainly is not. At the same time, it is definitely a play which draws attention to the wrongs that women faced. And in that sense, we might see it as feminist. And there's a couple of different angles I could take on this. One is, if we think about how thoroughly women were excluded from the production of ancient drama, I think that makes it more notable that it's a play that's so centrally concerned with the wrongs that women face. So tragedies were written by men, they were performed by a cast of exclusively male actors, and they were aimed primarily at a male audience, whether or not there were sometimes women present. And yet, what these men choose to do with their exclusive artistic license and with their free time is to dress up as women and lament the many wrongs that women suffer at the hands, specifically of men, married women. So it's clearly an issue that these men are deeply concerned about, but it's complicated thinking about how that fits into a message that's a call for action. The play also clearly doesn't offer an easy answer. Jason's actions are presented as not entirely unreasonable, and Medea's murders definitely stretched the audience's sympathy for her, probably to the breaking point for most viewers. But whether or not the audience thinks that Medea acted right, we definitely have a sympathy for her in those early scenes, and we can see what happens in the end as the natural continuation, if not maybe entirely logical or necessary, as a horrific response to the horrific situation that she has been put in. She's an immigrant who's separated from her family. She's been betrayed by her only ally in her new country and is now facing yet another exile. In addition to what we might consider the more simply gendered aspects of her dishonor and suffering. But the horror of her actions is divisive, it's complicated, it makes us leave the theater thinking, but it also really highlights the desperation of her situation. One other aspect I might draw out is that we could see the play as feminist simply because it portrays a woman like Medea. She is extremely clever and rhetorically adept. She repeatedly outwits the men around her. She's an awesome presence on stage who dominates the play from its beginning to its end. We can also think about her positioning as a jilted woman. The other characters in the play, Creon, Jason, to a certain extent Aegis, and definitely the chorus as well, assume that she is motivated by jealousy. And this is often part of her reception, is this idea of her as the ultimate jilted woman who avenges herself because she has been wronged in sort of a sexual sense. However, in the play, nowhere does Medea suggest that this is the case. She never acknowledges any love or desire for Jason. And instead, she casts her situation in strictly heroic terms. Rather than a wife or a lover, she's a valuable ally who helped Jason in his heroic quest. Rather than being jealous, she's outraged at what she sees not as a sexual wrong, but as an affront to her honor, kind of as a hero. In the sense, she presents herself as a peer to Achilles or Odysseus, really. And like these Homeric heroes, she also takes actions that might be viewed as terrible. In the sense, she possesses a degree of morally fraught agency that few female characters, at least today, will get. Maybe in Hollywood movies, we don't see women like this that often. And in that sense, we might see the play as displaying a certain kind of feminism, even if it's really ambiguous.
I think that's a great point, especially this idea of viewing Greek heroes as ambivalent figures. Because, I mean, I think there's sometimes a temptation to see them as these like comic book type heroes, like Superman or something, like Achilles going out and doing great works in the name of justice or whatever it is. And that's not really who they are. So putting Medea in that sort of pantheon of heroes, I think, is a really important, not only way of looking at her, but reminder of how fraught these other heroic characters are.
Yeah, and especially even in their reception on the tragic stage, if we think about characters like Ajax, whose actions are hardly admirable, or Heracles, who kills his family in the course of Euripides' play. Medea really is being put on an equal with the male Homeric heroes. So in that sense, yeah, it's an equalizer in a kind of horrible way.
Yeah. One difference maybe between Medea and a lot of other heroes on the tragic stage is the Deus Ex Machina ending. Because, I mean, this is not Oedipus putting out his eyes and being exiled. This is not Ajax killing himself. This is not Antigone in the cave. I mean, as you said, Medea takes off on the sun chariot, goes to Athens, and as far as the play tells us, lives consequence-free. So what do you make of the ending of this play?
I'm not sure I can see an easy answer there. I think that in performance, it's a real tour de force. It really affirms the unrepentant kind of gloriousness of her and leaves you without closure. Whereas in another, you might have her experience a downfall. Here it's, I mean, in some ways there's a question of who the hero is another issue we might consider with that. You mentioned Antigone.
Definitely.
And, Antigone is a motivating force, but in some ways she really isn't the central figure of her play. We have Creon, who is the one who takes a lot of the decisive actions and suffers their consequences. So if we think about that relationship between Antigone and Creon, or, in Oedipus, we have King Oedipus is the one who is making these fateful missteps and then suffers the consequences.
Yeah.
Here we have kind of that classic storyline, except for it would be with Jason, that Jason is the one who has pursued a certain line of narrative action, and in the end he pays the price for it, and it's too late. He's already saw consequences, and yet he clearly is not the central figure of this play the way Creon or Oedipus are in their plays. We have kind of a reversal of the narrative prototype, of the dramatic prototype there, that we've taken kind of the villain and made her the main character. And then in the end, when she gets away with it, you don't get a sense of resolution. And so maybe you're left contemplating those issues more than you would if she had paid some sort of price. There'd be an easy answer that the play would give you. Instead, we don't get that.
And I think that's very, very much Euripides' approach a lot of times. He seems to like ambiguity more than especially somebody like Aeschylus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder in that sense, I hadn't thought about it as distinctively Euripidean, but of course, in some of Euripides' later plays that we still have, and who knows how many that don't survive, we do have his tragedies with happy endings. And so maybe in a kind of twisted way, we could see this as a anticipating that trend, that we have a happy ending in a very limited sense of what you might call a happy ending, in that it doesn't have the typical reversal that you would see in a tragic drama. It continues on without that unfolding of events.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I want to switch gears a little bit and move closer to your particular specialty. I suspect most other people in the world, even people who've read a lot of Greek drama, don't really know almost anything about the music that was involved in ancient Greek tragedy or comedy. So can you give us a sort of overview of what we know about the music in Greek drama and how we know it?
Yeah. I'll start with just saying a little bit about the evidence. It's kind of pieced together from a lot of different sources. So one category we have is there's literary depictions of song and dance. Starting as early as Homer, we have images of choruses performing, not in dramatic contexts, but you still have the basic idea of song and dance, and you can see what its cultural associations are in those early sources, which of course would have been received in the time of classical drama as well.
Yeah.
We also have philosophical and scientific discussions of music and metrics. So these can be really technical sources that describe scale systems and their associations. Also descriptions of rhythmic genres, and the details of different metrical patterns, how they would be instantiated in actual time patterning. There's also works that describe the more general details of tragic performance. Most of these are significantly later, but they describe its song structure, what the sort of patterning of choreography would be, that sort of thing. So there's that ancient testimony. On a kind of completely separate side of things, we have evidence of real ancient melodies. So there's certain musical documents that have been preserved where you'll have the text written out with little letter type symbols written above each syllable, annotating what note that syllable is to be sung to. So it's kind of like sheet music, very simple compared to what we're used to today, but it can annotate what the sung melody would be. And there's quite a number of these ancient musical documents that all date to at least a couple hundred years after the period we're talking about. But you can extrapolate from them by comparing them to the earlier philosophical works and figure out maybe what the real musical template would be for the sort of larger phenomena that are being described kind of in theoretical terms. We also have fragments of musical instruments. So for example, pipes that you can look at the bore holes and where the finger holes are as well, and you can reconstruct what sounds they could have been made. So what notes could have been played on them. And if you look at what those notes are, you can match them up with scale systems that are described in the theoretical works and take them as further evidence for what the precise tunings would have been, how it would have shown up in a real cultural context. So that's kind of the body of evidence that we have to draw on. I can go on to tragedy itself.
Well, before you do that, can you give us a little bit of a sense of what this music might have sounded like? Like, are there things modern people might be familiar with that are similar?
That's difficult to say. I mean, it's song. I'll talk a little bit with tragedy about how you might consider some counterparts. Okay. But it's song. I think we all know song today. You can think about it as, it's not recorded. So it's something that you'd hear within a cultural context and you'd be used to hearing. You'd have songs that take place at weddings, you have funeral songs, you have a lot of different drinking songs, different genres that can then be brought into tragedy from this larger role that music plays in everyday life. You can, however, hear there's recordings that you can listen to of these ancient melodies that are recorded. One of the most famous is the Psycholos epitaph, which is an inscribed melody. It's a complete song, is what makes it so remarkable. But you can listen to recordings that are quite wonderful. I'd be happy to send you one if you want to include it.
Yeah, I'd love to put a link to that down in the description below the video.
Great. Yeah. So this kind of gives us a background for understanding tragic dance. There's only one fragment that we have that some scholars think might be an actual tragic melody. This is a fragment from Euripides' Orestes. So it's a musical papyrus that has lyrics from a choral ode in Orestes, along with this music notation. However, it comes from a couple hundred years after the play was performed, in a period when there were a lot of new musical settings of ancient texts. We have instances of iambic trimeters that are set to music, so it's clear that that is not part of the original musical setting. And so there's not really good grounds necessarily for viewing this papyrus as giving us a real ancient melody. But again, it's a wonderful example of what a melody might be like. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, tragedies were preserved without any musical notation. It doesn't seem to have been common practice in the classical period to annotate melodies. It would have been performed and taught orally and then passed around orally. So to get into tragic music itself, we have between each scene, there would be a choral ode. And for ancient audiences, these choral performances were actually perhaps the biggest attraction of going to see a tragedy. It's a huge spectacle. And you get ancient references to going to the choruses as a shorthand for going to see tragedies. Yeah. Aristotle also tells us that it's the original form of tragic performance, that you had originally sort of a series of songs, and eventually you started adding little spoken bits in between that slowly grew into a larger and larger part of the production, and that's the origin of tragedy, at least according to Aristotle. Who knows whether it's historical, but you can see that it reflects an understanding in his time that the choral performance was actually the central element, in a historical sense at least, of dramas in their time. So it's also key to remember that the chorus would have sung and danced. So it's a singing, dancing chorus, huge spectacle. The dance is rhythmically complex. We can see this in the metrics of the texts that survive. And it's also reflected in the descriptions that we get of ancient dance. It was also highly athletic. It's performed by young men from the community. So that's very different from how we might imagine a Greek chorus in a way that might involve sort of alienating chanting. It's much more like a pop music video, maybe with athletic, rhythmically complex dancing that is accompanied by also a rhythmically complex song. The dance also appears to have been figurative, I should mention. So they're sort of maybe acting out bits that we get in the lyrics. That's according to much later testimony, but it seems likely to have been the case based on some comments in earlier sources as well. The music itself was extremely popular and also memorable. We have a famous anecdote in Plutarch that soldiers who were stranded in Sicily during the Sicilian expedition some of them survived by remembering snippets from Euripides' choral odes. And if they could perform them, then people would take them in and feed them and give them safe passage, things like that. Such that according to Plutarch, when they got home from their mission, many of them went and thanked Euripides because it was his odes that saved them when they were out there. This shows us both that they could remember bits of his songs, having seen them in the theater, and just the breadth of the popularity of tragic music, that, all the way in Sicily, people were hungry to hear the latest Euripides. So it's really an international pop music phenomenon.
That's amazing.
In terms of its accompaniment, we might think of the lyre as the epitomal ancient instrument, but that's not true for tragedy. The lyre is the instrument of Homeric recitation, but tragedy is accompanied by the aulos. This was historically translated as flute, and you might still see that in some translations. That's really a misnomer. The word that's usually used now is pipe or pipes, and it's an instrument. It's a long reed instrument, and you play two of them at once, and they're double reeds, and they make a very extremely loud and intense kind of like buzzing explosion of sound. The closest instrument I've heard is a bagpipe, but it's like a really intense bagpipe. Culturally, it is considered to drive people into a frenzy, and is very controversial among conservative philosophers such as Plato. It seems to have held a status that's somewhat like you can think of a trumpet in early jazz, or maybe an electric guitar in rock and roll. It's controversial, exciting, thrilling when you hear it. That's a good way to be thinking about tragic music. It's not dull. It's not I mean, it can be serious in a sense, but it's this kind of seriousness that is also tied to Dionysiac frenzy, that there's a sort of madness and excitement to it. Huge spectacle, very engaging. I think that today we're a little bit uncomfortable with thinking of Greek tragedy in that way because of the way we sort of divide up high and low culture. And if this is serious high culture, we can't see, musical theater, like a big song and dance number as part of that. It's an awkward pairing for a lot of modern audiences, which is, I think, why you do get more often versions that involve a lot of alienated chanting, things that seem kind of distant and serious in a high, weighty art version that isn't really true to the original at all.
So basically, think Hamilton more than like white marble and colorless togas and things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hamilton is a wonderful example. I think it is the closest thing that I've ever seen to Greek tragedy. In terms of a format, I mean, it uses song and story and scenes on stage to contemplate a narrative. It's also a form of music that is kind of words up front, words and rhythms, which seems to have been very true, especially for, say, Aeschylean song. It's very rhythmically dense, very musically complex, but in a way that is focus on the words and focus on the rhythms. So hip hop really is a wonderful counterpoint to that. I also love Hamilton because it's taking a story that's somewhat familiar to a modern audience and then using it to reflect on contemporary issues. So if you think of it being performed in the context of Obama's presidency, kind of a time of optimism, a reclaiming of the founding fathers for a diverse and modern audience, but also, thinking about him as an immigrant and casting that as a kind of issue of our time. I think that's very true for Medea also, that you're taking this ancient story of an immigrant who is suffering in her own contemporary political situation to reflect on contemporary politics in Athens, which definitely had issues surrounding mothers and immigration. They were still struggling with Pericles' citizenship law, which had limited Athenian citizenship only to the children of citizen mothers. So you always had to have a citizen father. But previously, if you had a foreign-born wife, your children would be considered Athenian citizens. Under this law, that was no longer the case. And that was causing a lot of social issues, even at the time when Medea was performed. So I think that's another kind of point that makes Hamilton a good part. But I think that music can also be very thematic in tragedy. And I think that's certainly the case in Medea. This is kind of where I get into my research. I should say that the music of Medea has not been well studied particularly. And this is an ongoing project for me as well. It's an area that I'm really interested in, but I'll maybe lay out some of what I think are the more clearly identifiable themes in how Medea is using music to tell a story. So the chorus in Medea is a group of local women. So these are the Corinthian women. When Medea comes on stage, she sort of wins them over as her allies by emphasizing the elements that they have in common as women and the misfortunes that they have experienced. The Corinthian women seem really taken with her at first. And in their first formal ode, this is what we'd call the first stasimone when studying Greek tragedy. They use their lyrics in this song to cast Medea's situation as a precise reversal of how women have been portrayed in Homeric literature in particular, but in earlier musical genres more generally. So whereas earlier songs portrayed unfaithful wives, we might think particularly of Clytemnestra, these women who betrayed their husbands, now we have the sort of like the tides have turned, and now we have a story in which it's the husband who has betrayed his wife and is taking on a new bride. They really emphasize this reversal of literary precedent And then that seems to be reflected in their music as well. They contrast old and new song in their lyrics, but then also do it with sort of two different musical styles. Of course, the music itself is lost, but the meter and the pitch accents here can trace two very different styles of melody in this ode. The first one evokes Homeric recitation and is paired with lyrics that are emulating Homeric diction, and they even borrow a line from Homer's Odyssey verbatim and use it in the course of their song here. This is contrasted with a second melodic style that is evoking sapphic lyric, and which they use to underscore their descriptions of how they're going to establish a new era of poetry that's specifically female song. And this contrast seems to have been embodied in their music, in that they parody this Homeric recitation with a kind of monotonous melodic style. And then they contrast it with their new female song, which is inspired by, the music suggests, antiquity's most famous female songwriter, Sappho. And of course, because Sappho is from Lesbos on the coast of Turkey, she can also serve as a model of sort of Eastern imports, and particularly of an Eastern female song tradition that makes a particularly apt musical counterpart to Medea. And we can sort of see the music then as reflecting their willingness to embrace Medea in a kind of musical appropriation of what they view as Eastern femaleness, and trying to take that on for themselves as a musical identity. And this carries on through the central odes of the play as they continue developing this sort of sapphic song style until things kind of break down further on as they lose their connection with Medea after she announces her plan to murder her children. And this is reflected in the music as well. They shift to a distinctively tragic form of choral song. They use a meter called dochmiax that is really uneven, really kind of unhinged in that final ode where the children are being murdered, and seem to have kind of lost the harmoniousness of their new sapphic song style. Interestingly, however, Sappho was also credited in antiquity with the invention of the Mixolydian mode. So this is a style of melody also associated with a scale system that was very strongly associated with tragic song in the classical period. So in a weird way, their adoption of sapphic song as a model for their choral odes is a little bit ominous, maybe, in these early odes, suggesting the invention of tragedy and the use of like a really strongly tragic musical style that will come at the end of the play. So music is really not an accompaniment here. Aristotle calls it a sweetener to tragedy. He very much downplays the role of music within tragedy. But you can see it here as maybe really central to how the audience would have come to understand the thematic elements of the narrative. So it frames them in terms that are perceptible, not just in terms of the lyrics coming into your ears, but the music and the dance as well.
I think that's fascinating, and it is worth it's worth noting that Aristotle writes the better part of a century after sort of the high point of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So by that point, tragedy had somewhat shifted in its approach. So I wonder if that's one of those areas where Aristotle is writing about what was going on in tragedy at his time and sort of projecting that back onto the previous century as well.
Yeah, I'd say you certainly have a trend across the course of the 5th century. So before Aristotle, but across the tragedies that we do have, Euripides in particular became much more interested in monody, so solo songs, somewhat more like we might think of musical theater now, where you have actors singing individual songs rather than the chorus performing kind of as a civic entity. And that definitely shifts the role that music plays within a tragedy. They tend to be more musically elaborate in a way that is melodic and maybe less closely tied to the lyrics. Plato complains about this a lot, and Aristotle might in some way be reacting to that, although it's also clear that all three of the canonical tragedians were reperformed kind of in repertory, even in Aristotle's time. Tragedy and old tragedies continued to be wildly popular and were reperformed and maybe even adapted in these later contexts in festivals. I think that Aristotle is also very much reacting to Plato's critiques of music. Plato is extremely skeptical of tragic music and of the fact that you would have young citizen men performing in a chorus in particular. It's part of their education, and as an educational experience, you can see that, being in a play like Medea, dressing up as women who complain about the situation that women face, you could see that as maybe not something that a politically conservative elite man would like to be part of his children's education. Sounds quite topical today with all of the controversy happening in schools. But I think that Aristotle is maybe responding to Plato's critique by trying to emphasize the elements of tragic performance that we can see as rational, the way the plot fits together like a carefully crafted argument that has a very structural meaning, in which he doesn't really see music as a part of that, and maybe is downplaying music, particularly to reclaim tragedy in response to Plato. He's really not an excellent source in many ways for thinking about how audiences in antiquity understood tragedy, so much as how political philosophers in antiquity thought about tragedy, and particularly its educational value.
So I want to shift slightly here, because the question of contemporary connections has already come up a couple of times. So based on what we know about the music in ancient Greek tragedy, how can or do modern theater practitioners, how can modern theater practitioners use some of this information or incorporate some of this into contemporary performance? Or maybe more specifically, how have you incorporated this information into the productions you've been associated with?
I mean, my research and my interest in all of these musical aspects of tragedy come from my experience working on productions and working with composers, trying to figure out how you can musically bring out the meaning of the text, and then realizing that the text kind of sets you up to be able to do it. But I think that how can a modern production do it? There's so many different ways. I think the main thing that comes to mind is to maybe end the practice of viewing the chorus as an alienating force on stage, as something that is foreign to a modern audience. I think that in practice, if you put a chorus on stage and you have them perform in like a song and dance numbers, the audience responds amazingly strongly. It's really hard for it not to steal the show for a lot of audiences. And maybe in some ways, if you have a large actor playing one of these big roles like Medea, maybe it's uncomfortable to have the chorus steal the show. Might be another factor that has to be taken into account. I do think, practically speaking, because of the challenges of performing Greek tragedy, it has these huge speeches, a very sort of elevated tone that isn't very naturalistic in the scenes themselves. It often is performed more like, say, by a Shakespeare company than by a musical theater company, which changes the types of expertise that are available as you're putting together the performance. And I can think about, I've faced those practical issues myself as well, thinking about whether, can you get a choral director? Can you get a choreographer? How do you run all of those rehearsals while also trying to make a narrative which is very, if anything, I see the scenes as the more alienating part of a Greek tragedy. It's a very heightened style of drama. And to get that to work and all the complexities of bringing that across while at the same time organizing a singing, dancing chorus is quite a challenge logistically, which I can appreciate for a lot of modern productions.
Yeah.
I do think that if you can get a singing, dancing chorus, that is definitely the way to go. And you can play with it in ways that really bring out the themes of the production. So, for example, in this production of Medea that I'm currently working on, like I mentioned, we're looking at using a lot of different musical genres from 20th century music and playing particularly with these ideas of appropriation, that you have the Corinthian women in Medea are sort of taking on what they view as their Medea style of music in using these sapphic melodic patterns and using that as sort of a symbol of their solidarity with her, even though they really kind of abandon her, and in the end, it's almost a little bit superficial in a way, as it turns out. So we're sort of playing with musical appropriation in that way, with taking, say, jazz, a Nina Simone style of Black female artistry, and having the chorus sort of play with those ideas in a way that I think is kind of problematic for a modern audience as well, and might get at some of the problems that are in the play, and sort of make you think more deeply about how Medea is being treated by those around her through the music, as well as what we actually see happen on stage.
I think that's really interesting. So you don't recommend bagpipes then for modern productions?
I think that could be very cool. I have not yet seen a production that used bagpipes. There might very well have been one, though. I'll have to look into that. I think a saxophone or an electric guitar are also solid choices in terms of getting the cultural meaning across.
All right. Well, this has been really, really fascinating. And again, I imagine that the majority of people out there know very little about ancient Greek music at all. So this has been really informative. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.